First slide. Welcome. This is a webinar sponsored by Nuclear Information and Resource Service on high-level nuclear waste. We are specifically focusing tonight on centralized interim, so-called interim storage, and transport dangers. We have three presenters. One is Karen Hadden from the Sustainable Energy and Economic Development Coalition out of Texas, also near the New Mexico proposed centralized site. Dr. Arjun Makhijani with Institute for Energy and Environmental Research, followed by Kevin Kamps from Beyond Nuclear. And I'm Diane Dorigo. We're with Nuclear Information and Resource Service. And the purpose for tonight's webinar is to learn about the characteristics, dangers of so-called interim centralized storage and transportation of irradiated or spent nuclear fuel. We've got about maybe 15 minutes for each of the presenters, and then we will have questions and answers. And we'll move into the first presenter, Karen Hadden.
Hi everyone, this is Karen Hadden with Seed Coalition, and I'm going to be talking about the high-level radioactive waste posing risks for Texas, but I want to point out from the start that it's not just for Texas, it's New Mexico, and it's also for anyone, anywhere in the country, especially along the transportation routes, that this plan for consolidated storage of high-level waste poses new and very dangerous risks.
Karen, sorry, this is Tim Judson at NEARS. It looks like it's waiting for something to happen on your screen. Do you want to make sure that that it's ready to show your slides?
Oh, let's see, show my screen. Okay, I am so sorry about that. Can you see the screen?
Not yet.
There it is.
Yes.
And so, yeah, you might want to turn it into slide mode.
And you do that.
Does that work now?
Yes.
Are you good?
It does.
Okay.
It's great.
Okay, so first of all, what is high-level radioactive waste? It is mainly the fuel rods that have come out of a nuclear reactor. Often they're called spent fuel. We prefer to call them irradiated fuel because when they come out of the reactor, they are much more radioactive than when they were put in originally. They still contain about 97% of the original uranium, and they have to go into a spent fuel pool to cool off. Typically it's about 5 years. It can be anywhere from 3 to 10 years, but usually around 5. And then after that, they can be pulled out and put into dry cask storage and stored with security on site. There can be exposure to radiation if there are problems or accidents. And in general, ionizing radiation causes chemical damage. One moment, please. Turn something off. My apologies. So exposure to radiation, depending on the kind of radiation and the length and time of exposure and the nature of it, it could actually kill you directly if you are exposed to high-level waste. And different kinds of exposure, different lengths of exposure, or chronic exposure can result in cancers of various kinds, tumors, cataracts, genetic changes. And exposure to more than 75 rads in a short time can cause radiation sickness, nausea, vomiting, headache, diarrhea, up to days in length of time. Fatigue, fever, even seizures and coma, up to several months. And this is off of NRC sources. Skin damage, blisters, ulcers, swelling and itching, temporary hair loss, sometimes bone marrow transplants could be needed, and death can come from infections or internal bleeding. So again, this varies a lot with the kind of exposure and the nature of the exposure, but these are some of the impacts. This high-level waste is extremely dangerous. It's the most radioactive of all radioactive materials. The proposed high-level radioactive waste storage facilities that we're going to be talking about are proposed by 3 companies Two of them are proposals that are pretty far along. Waste Control Specialist, the first one, is known typically as WCS. They already have a low-level radioactive waste facility in West Texas, right on the New Mexico border. It's right where there's a right angle in the shape of Texas, just north of that, on the border. And they have already applied to the NRC, they did this in April, for a consolidated interim storage facility now to take the high-level radioactive waste, the irradiated fuel rods. They want to bring in 40,000 metric tons over a 40 years time period for storage, and they plan to have extensions, so they plan to keep this waste for a long, long time. And their plan is to have it stored on a storage pad in the open air in the desert where there are very extreme temperatures, and there is fracking in the area. So far there have not been earthquakes, but we don't know if that will continue to be true. Their application had numerous deficiencies, which they are working on now to fix. It was about halfway complete. It was very, very shoddy when it was submitted. We have on our website, which is nonuclearwaste.key, and we'll give that to you in writing real soon, an analysis of those many, many deficiencies. The Eddie Lee Energy Alliance is another company that wants, this one is sometimes referred to as Holtec because that's their partner, and they plan to apply this fall, or now they are thinking about this spring, for consolidated interim storage in Hobbs, New Mexico, which is really not far away, and they want to take at least 70,000 metric tons and maybe more. The last company, AFCI, is one that's owned by Monty Humble and Bill Jones. Both are very close friends of our former governor, Rick Perry. They have not had any luck in getting a site, and so they are planning to still look for a site in Culberson County. So you can see here the site with the X is the WCS site. The little star is right across the way in New Mexico where there is already uranium enrichment with Urenco. And there's a circle with a star up above it where the Eddie Lee Energy Alliance, or ELEA, wants to put a site. And there is a plus sign over by Carlsbad where there is also the existing WIP site, the Waste Isolation Pilot Project. So you probably have heard about the Yucca Mountain site in Nevada that was going to be the nation's high-level radioactive waste repository. This is a permanent repository by contrast to storage, but this project has been halted and there is currently no permanent repository in the country for nuclear waste. So the Blue Ribbon Commission met to discuss America's nuclear future, and they had a report in January of 2012 where they recommended a consent-based approach to siting future nuclear waste storage and disposal sites. They know that nobody wants this stuff, and they thought that trying to force it on unwilling communities hasn't worked, so now they're trying to find volunteers, is what we are told. The DOE hopes that there might be consent for consolidated storage and or a permanent repository. Now Texas and New Mexico are the prime targets for potential sites for consolidated storage of nuclear waste. Other locations have been discussed, but these are the two that are furthest along, and it appears that these are the ones that the DOE really is excited about. And the DOE held a series of meetings this year, and they did this in Chicago, Atlanta, Sacramento, Denver, Boston, Tempe, Arizona, Boise, Idaho, and Minneapolis. They started with a kickoff meeting in Washington, D.C. And you can see on this map that these 8 cities are, you know, going around the country in a great big arc. And there's a big gap in the middle of the country, which includes Texas and New Mexico, that they did not set up even a single meeting. No public meeting was held in Texas or New Mexico, the most targeted region. And the DOE was busy talking to people about the importance of bringing in the stakeholders from the start, but they were intentionally avoiding our area. And here in Texas and in New Mexico, we have been saying we do not consent. There is no consent among the people that we talk to high-level radioactive waste storage. We consider it extreme environmental injustice. The communities in Texas and New Mexico that would be closest to the high-level radioactive waste storage sites are largely Hispanic communities, and they are without adequate resources to defend themselves. They are not wealthy communities. We question why the nation's radioactive waste should be dumped on them. It does not seem right at all. And nuclear reactor waste would likely come through Dallas-Fort Worth and other major cities. This map shows the reactors, 90 on the East Coast that are operating, and then 4 on the West Coast. And the transport routes would be probably train routes going through major cities, Dallas-Fort Worth out to West Texas, and then the reactors in the lower portion of the southeastern U.S. would probably come through Houston, San Antonio, and then out to West Texas. And the West Coast reactors would be transported through El Paso. And of course, they would go through major cities throughout the country on their way to get out west. This map is based on the projected routes that were anticipated for Yucca Mountain. And so we have extrapolated to what we think would happen if it was going to West Texas. They have not been approved. The Department of Transportation has not designated routes. Our state environmental agency, which is not known to be strong on any front, actually wrote a report in March of 2014 and pointed out that there are risks of sabotage if this waste is transported, especially through highly populated areas. They said that it was safer actually to leave it at existing sites and keep it secure than to put it onto highways or railways or waterways. Transporting radioactive waste has high-level risks. To the WCS site, they would expect to have 1 or 2 trains per week for at least 24 years, and each train would carry somewhere from 2 to 4 shipping casks. We've had train accidents, and you can see in the photo that here's a collision that happened just in June of this year, 65-mile-per-hour head-on collision in the Panhandle. And we hesitate to think what would have happened if that train was carrying high-level radioactive waste. There have been accident predictions that were for DOE, and they said if there were 53,000 train trips, truck trips, 53 accidents were likely. For train accidents, they anticipated at least 1 per 10,000 trips, and that there would be at least 1 train accident. Even if there was a small contamination or radiation release from a serious accident, 20 or 42 square miles of land could be contaminated. And this was their calculations for Yucca Mountain. They estimated that cleanup costs could exceed $620 million in the rural area, or in an urban area, it could be up to $9.5 billion to raise and rebuild the most heavily contaminated square mile in a downtown area. So we'll skip a little further here. Homeowners insurance is going to exclude damages from radiation leaks, so those along transport routes would probably be at great risk if there was an accident. And while the Price-Anderson Act might provide some financial protection, there's not nearly enough money in it, and there would be probably quite a fight over liability. We're concerned about potential terrorism incidents, radiation releases, and emergency preparedness. And as we mentioned, the TCEQ report highlights the risk of a terrorist attack and accidents. And they also raise the question of the likelihood of a storage site becoming a de facto long-term repository, which it was never intended to be. The science has not been done. The science is yet to be done on even the storage, much less any kind of permanent repository. More information would be needed about emergency preparedness and training of responders, what equipment would be needed. We feel like the state is woefully unprepared, and that human error, equipment failure in unforeseen circumstances could lead to terrorism opportunities. All of these possibilities need to be researched and considered before any decisions get made. We also feel that the science should come first. We should be looking for a site that is safe geologically for permanent disposal, as opposed to finding this short-term approach that is a false solution. Again, the risk of permanent disposal, becoming a de facto permanent disposal site. If Texas accepts the waste, there's a good chance it will never go anywhere else. The utilities would no longer be lobbying for a final repository, and Congress wouldn't be likely to fund one. The TCEQ raised this issue, and leaving the waste in an above-ground storage pad for over 40 years in an area of temperature extremes is incredibly dangerous. So the license application is very flawed that WCS submitted. It's very incomplete, about 50% complete. The NRC wrote up 31 pages of problems with it, and they mentioned that they wanted to know more about how water contamination would be prevented. They felt that there was inadequate monitoring of radiation, inadequate emergency planning and engineering studies, that there would be potential climate impacts on the waste from extreme desert heat, and more. The WCS company is potentially going to be sold to Energy Solutions. They've got an agreement to sell to Energy Solutions, but there are antitrust issues, and the sale has not yet been approved by the Department of Justice. We don't think that Congress and the legislature here in Texas should act at all at this point in time. The DOE has not finalized their supposed consent rules, and the legislature has no busy acting at this point in time. The DOE concept of consent is flawed to begin with, and the process, again, should be based on science, not political pressure. There is a bill that has been introduced in Congress by Representative Conaway from Texas, and it's H.R. 3643, which would open up Texas and New Mexico to becoming the nation's high-level radioactive waste dump, and it fleeces the taxpayers. So first of all, the current law prohibits the federal government for paying for a private interim consolidated storage facility, for a private one. And H.R. 3643 changes that so that the Department of Energy could sign contracts with any private person/company that holds a license for an interim consolidated storage facility. So this is what the companies are wanting so that they can move forward. The bill would also appropriate funds to pay for storage in an interim consolidated storage facility from the cumulative interest generated by the Nuclear Waste Fund each fiscal year, and allows nuclear utilities to continue to be paid for taxpayers for continuing to store the waste that would still be at their plants. So there's payments on either end, and this is what the nuclear utilities want. They want the government, the DOE, to take liability but continue to be funded by the federal government. So here's how you can help. We're asking everyone who can to help out through donations, through contacting local officials, asking them to halt to efforts to dump high-level radioactive waste on Texas and New Mexico, and its transport for this purpose. We insist that state and local studies be done to determine the impacts of an accident involving radioactive waste or terrorist attacks. We need to know what actually we're talking about if this proposal is being considered. We are urging people to organize, to print out and circulate a petition that we have to gather signatures. That's available online. And anyone and everyone in the country, please help oppose H.R. 3643 in Congress, telling Representative Conaway and co-sponsors that you oppose the bill, asking them to withdraw support and to instead prevent high-level radioactive dumping and transport for the purpose of storage. There are 33 co-sponsors. Texas has 12 of them, which their names are listed here. And other congressional representatives should be asked to actively oppose the bill as well. We ask that people contact the media because not enough people know about this issue. We urge you to speak out about your concerns about high-level radioactive waste dumping, about the injustice that it represents and its transport through our state and your state, and the potential impacts to water bodies, aquifers, to the health of people along the route. And thank you so very much.
Thanks, Karen. We will be having a webinar on the on-site storage and in the high-level waste issue in another week. At this point, we're going to shift over to Dr. Arjun Makhijani, who is with the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research. And Arjun, if you've got your slides ready, if you could hook them in and begin. Are you there, Arjun? We don't have him muted, do you? Yeah, he's muted. Okay.
Yeah. You hear me?
Apologies. You're unmuted now. My great apologies.
No problem. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, let's go. All right. Now I scroll through it, right?
Yeah, you might want to put it into slideshow mode.
Okay. All right. There we go. Did that do it? No. Control F5. No.
Is it up in
Which is it? Is it function F8?
I'm not sure, but I'm sure if you select the slide from the slideshow menu at the top.
Slideshow menu at the top.
design, move to your right. It's the fifth one.
Design. Okay, design.
You see design, then go to the left, transitions, then animations, then slideshow.
Okay. All right. All right.
Yeah. Huh. Did you click on, yeah.
I did.
And then to the left where it says from beginning. There you go.
All right. There we go. Okay.
Hey. Oh.
I'm going to tell you a little bit about nuclear waste in the great state of Texas. All right, I will scroll through the first few slides which are on nuclear power. You know all about that, and this is for background. All right, so Karen's already talked about how dangerous this is. I'm going to talk about the risk that centralized storage may become permanent, and there's no incentive for a repository once the federal government takes title, and what to do. How about interim on-site storage, avoiding needless transportation, and a path to a repository, and setting radiation protection standards in advance. All right, so what's in fresh fuel and what's in spent fuel or irradiated fuel? So fresh fuel consists only of uranium. It has 3 isotopes in it, and you see that in the left column. U-235 is what fissions to provide energy. U-238 absorbs neutrons and becomes plutonium. So some of that is converted to plutonium. Some of the plutonium is consumed in reactor operation and gives energy. And then about 1% is still left over when the fuel is basically uneconomical to continue to operate in a reactor. And 20 tons are removed every year from a typical reactor. And then FP is fission products. So initially there are none, and then at the end, in this particular example, about 4.6% becomes fission products, and the last line is heavy isotopes, americium and so on, neptunium. So I don't know why this thing is obscuring the top. I'll not try to fix it. So fresh fuel is radioactive with alpha particles, so they're not very penetrating. There's not a lot of heat. You see that fuel rod, you can hold it in your hand. It will produce some radiation to your hand, so not safe in the perfect sense, but it won't kill you. Spent fuel or irradiated fuel, once it's removed from the reactor, is extremely radioactive, death in seconds. And then even after 100 years of cooling, it will give a lethal dose in a few hours at a yard. Lethal dose is several hundred rad. So this is a new home storage in San Onofre. This is how dry storage works. There's a canister inside each one of those each sort of receptacle, and that's a metal canister. Obviously that would be removed and put in a transportation cask before transportation. So how much are we talking about? 100,000 metric tons. A metric ton is about 2,200 pounds. When we say a metric ton, we don't really mean the weight of the whole thing. We mean the weight of the original uranium inside the fuel. So the weight of the spent fuel itself and the packaging is a lot more than what we see here. So DOE projects that the reactors will produce about 100,000 or more metric tons by the time they're all shut, maybe 120,000. Now each metric ton contains about 10 kilograms of plutonium, a little more than one Nagasaki bomb worth of plutonium. So currently we have about 100,000 metric tons would have about 120,000 nuclear bombs worth of plutonium. So this is the one reason why spent fuel poses a security risk, and one reason people have advocated repositories, because leaving it sitting at sites invites theft in the long term, and then you have nuclear materials more available than you want them to be. Of course, also contains high quantities of fission products, and I've given a couple of basically educational examples that the strontium-90, if diluted uniformly in the freshwater supply of the entire world, would contaminate it to 60 times the drinking water standards. So that's a lot of strontium-90. Strontium-90 is very radioactive, goes to the bone marrow. And plutonium-239 from 1 2-reactor plant operating for 60 years would be sufficient to contaminate all of the Ogallala aquifer to 25 times the drinking water limit for thousands of years. So we're talking stuff that is pretty catastrophic for the environment if dispersed into the environment in various ways, especially water. All right, so one of the threats of the proposal is that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission issued what is called the Continued Storage Rule that says that the federal government will be around for tens of thousands of years, long after the reactors have been shut, and I'm sure we will have alternative, much better energy technologies long before them. We already do. And that every year they will appropriate money. Every year they will appropriate money for the site security, and every 100 years they will appropriate money for the whole infrastructure to be changed out, because the canisters and casks will have rusted and will need to be changed out. In reality, the NRC has never overseen even a single transfer of spent fuel from one dry cask to another. When it was petitioned about this about 15 years ago, how would you transfer damaged spent fuel? It said that it would know the fuel was damaged when it was transferring it and would figure out what to do then. So punting about damaged spent fuel. So we know there are damaged spent fuel rods today, including fuel that has been used to produce a lot of energy, which is called high burnup fuel. And all of this is contrary to history and common sense. In fact, the draft of this rule was proposed during a government shutdown. It is also contrary to the NRC's own guidance about institutional control, National Academy's guidance, all of which says that you should not assume indefinite institutional control, that your safety standard should be set assuming that after 100 years or a few hundred years, there will be no more government and no more artificial physical barriers preventing access. That's another reason that we talk about repositories, because access is much more difficult. All right. Karen already talked about the Texas Council on Environmental Quality, that it is vulnerable to sabotage. So this is the central reason I am opposed to unnecessary transportation, and transporting it now is completely unnecessary. It just creates one more site. takes it through cities, through countryside, and then it doesn't solve any problem. So you've already heard about the proposal. There's an increase of terrorism risk. The way I like to think about this, the least complex way to think about what would happen is if there were a successful terrorist attack that resulted, say, in some of the spent fuel burning or release of radioactivity in some way. It would be akin to what is called a dirty bomb or a radiological dispersal device. Homeland Security and others, Congressional Research Service have studied this. For instance, the study I cite here, 1,000 curie cesium-137 dispersal device, if it were to be cleaned up to the kind of radiation standards that are normal in today's radiation protection, would cost about $80 billion just for the cleanup. And you can imagine cleanup in an urban area, hosing this stuff down with water, and then the water winding up in rivers. And so this is not really cleanup. We know we really don't clean up radioactive materials, except we really shift them from one place to another. It's much more difficult to disperse radioactive materials in spent fuel because it's in the ceramic pellets and it's in canisters. But on the other hand, each spent fuel transport would contain a lot more than 1,000 curies of cesium. So you only have to disperse a small fraction of the cesium in it in order to create a very, very major and maybe insuperable problems of cleanup. You're talking about very serious social and economic disruption. So what have we recommended as the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research? So you have to store it in spent fuel pools for some time. We've advocated low density open frame storage. This is part of the principles that many organizations have signed on to, including NEARS and Beyond Nuclear, and you'll find this on our website. Move as much spent fuel as possible to hardened dry storage on site. By hardened, it's a complex concept, but approximately to harden it to terrorist attacks so the probability of successful attack is lowered and the consequences, if there is a successful attack, by successful I mean terrorists actually succeed in damaging the spent fuel, that the consequences are much reduced. So those are sort of the criteria for succeeding to harden the storage on site. And sometimes you may want to move the spent fuel. There's Prairie Island in the middle of the Mississippi River that has spent fuel. Not a very good place. They're really no good place, but there are some places that are really much more environmentally dangerous than others, and we may want to move it as close to the site as possible, but safer for the environment. And from a security, but safer for the environment primarily, mostly, and seismic zones, for instance, on the California coast. So centralized, moving spent fuel to a centralized storage such as proposed for Texas and maybe proposed for New Mexico really increases risks needlessly, creates one more site or two more sites, and involves transportation that is not needed that we should avoid. We should be trying to reduce risks, not increase them. It solves no problem other than the federal government is paying for storage of this waste because it violated the contracts to start taking it in 1998, and that problem can be solved in other ways. So this is where there are dry storage installations today. And in the long term, I believe we need a deep geologic repository, and that is part of an isolation system. It must be done right. By isolation, I don't mean perfect isolation. It needs to be to radiation standards that I think at least as good as what we use for ourselves today. NRC has been licensing reactors, saying that it knows what to do with this stuff, even though it doesn't have a repository. I won't go through all the fine print, but I don't think the NRC should be licensing more creation of this waste because it doesn't really know what to do with it, and we don't have a viable repository program. We need, so Yucca Mountain has, was the single site. It has a pretty sordid history. I won't go through it. We don't have the time. but it was the worst site, in my opinion, that has been investigated in this country. So I'm glad that it was abandoned. I opposed it, even though I do think we need a sound program for geologic isolation. And the basics of an isolation system are not just the repository, it's the spent fuel containers, the backfill and the sealing system, and then the geologic setting. So they must all work together, and at Yucca Mountain they wouldn't have. It was all on the metal containers, which may not have lasted very long. We do have examples of good repository programs, not perfect by a long shot, but Sweden has a much better program and a much more successful program. And I don't think we should be looking for sites of any kind, especially not interim storage, but even geologic. I think it's premature to look for geologic sites. We need to first look at isolation systems and what will work and where they might work for, I think, about 10 years before proposing site selection. All right, so those are the steps that I recommend. Set radiation protection standards. So this is what I call informed consent. Do the science first and then study the isolation systems, what will work, what will not work, and then go to the public. And we need a different institution than the DOE, because the DOE has completely failed for more than 30 years in the repository business. Thank you.
Thank you, Arjun. Our next presenter is Kevin Kamps. He's with Beyond Nuclear and are you the radioactive waste watchdog? Yes. Okay.
Very good.
Kevin's going to talk to us about the transport issue.
Is this the advance? Okay. Hello, everybody. It's a real honor to be invited to present here alongside Arjun and Karen. And the title of my talk is Mobile Chernobyl. I'm focusing on the risks of transporting irradiated nuclear fuel. And the origin of the slogan is NIERS, Michael Marriott, and there's the sticker that NIERS used for years. And that was a key slogan in our fight against the Yucca Mountain legislation on Capitol Hill for 20 years so far. So whether we're talking centralized interim storage, which can be called de facto permanent parking lot dumps, and this is Margene Bullcreek of Skull Valley Goshoots, who led the opposition to a parking lot dump in Utah successfully in the end, or whether we're talking permanent burial sites like Yucca Mountain, Nevada on western Shoshone Indian land, and here's a sweat lodge at Yucca. We're talking unprecedented numbers of mobile Chernobyls that would pass through most states. And this image shows infrared thermal heat, but there is gamma radiation that streams off of these shipments. And this gives you an idea of what these mostly rail, large, giant, heavy containers would look like on the trains. And this is from Japan, giving you an idea what they look like. So there is no magic wand like pro-Yucca Senator from Michigan, Carl Levin, seemed to think there was. Just magically get it out to Nevada and everything's fine. These shipments would go through 100 major cities across this country. So what are the risks? They are crashes, fires, drops from heights, underwater submersions, terrorist attacks. So here's another image that NIERS has on its website. What if high-level radioactive waste had been on this particular train? And here's an image from Sandia National Labs in New Mexico. They brag up the fire design criteria for these shipping containers, but it actually dates back many decades. It's a relatively low temperature fire, 1,475 degrees Fahrenheit. For example, diesel fuel burns at 1,800 degrees. And fires in the real world in our transportation infrastructure can burn for a lot longer than just 30 minutes. So here's another image from the Sandia tests. These tests have been used for public relations purposes for the nuclear power industry for decades. Very deceptive misuse of what took place at Sandia decades ago now. There have been no full-scale physical tests on these containers. Here's another real-world accident. Thank goodness there was no high-level radioactive waste involved in this. This was Interstate 40 in Oklahoma in spring of 2002, ironically right at the time of the big votes on Capitol Hill about Yucca Mountain. So if a shipping container were to hit an unyielding surface like a bridge abutment or rocks, it could be forceful enough to breach the container. Here's another real-world accident, a drop from a height, Interstate 895 in Baltimore, that exploded. So there are real-world accidents that are more forceful than the design criteria for these containers. This is a sunken barge. One of the scenarios here is that if water infiltrates one of these shipping containers, there's enough fissile material, things like uranium-235, plutonium-239, in the high-level radioactive waste that if it forms a critical mass in an underwater submersion, you could actually spark a nuclear chain reaction in the waste. Here's a political cartoon from Buffalo, New York, where liquid, highly radioactive waste shipments are targeted by truck going to Savannah River from Canada. Again, the security issues of that. Here's a Department of Energy map showing road and rail routes through places like Baltimore, Maryland. Another real-world accident that could have breached one of these containers if it had been on board this train. A train tunnel under downtown Baltimore. You see the thick black smoke that was blowing on the wind. And there was a study done by the state of Nevada. It was carried out by Dr. Marvin Resnikoff of Radioactive Waste Management Associates. The fire burned for over 24 hours at that temperature I mentioned, 1,475 degrees Fahrenheit. And Dr. Resnikoff's estimates, inevitably around 50 people would have eventually died from cancer if the high-level radioactive waste shipping container had breached in that fire. Again, this is hypothetical. There was no waste on board the train that burned. If people continued to live in contaminated zones in downtown Baltimore for a year, then we're talking over 1,000 latent cancer fatalities over time. And if people continued to live in contamination for 50 years, we're talking thousands of latent cancer fatalities, up to 32,000, as you can see. So this is a shipment route map for Chicago under the Yucca Mountain program. And both the colored lines and also the white lines there show where these shipments would go. One of the places that's pretty astounding is that one of these shipment routes is within a quarter mile of the Art Institute of Chicago, right in the dead heart of downtown. Incredibly enough, Congressman Shimkus from Illinois, who's a huge proponent of the Yucca Mountain dump, likely of these parking lot dumps as well, has no concerns about shipping this stuff around the country, did not even know a year ago about the Art Institute shipping route. In fact, he denied it when it was brought up during the hearing. And unfortunately, it is the case. So again, the consequences to human health and the environment would depend on how much gets out of these shipping containers, where it goes in the environment. This graphic shows where in the human body these various radioactive poisons would concentrate and do their harm. A microscopic amount of plutonium in the human lung is at high risk of causing lung cancer over time. Will the radioactive Russian roulette on the transport routes line up in a bad way and cause disaster? That's the question. And remember who's in charge of all this. The Department of Energy has a terrible track record in various ways, including nuclear waste transportation. So don't believe them when they say it's safe. Another aspect, we've been talking about accident and attack potentials, but what about the gamma radiation that streams out of these containers even with the radiation shielding? You can get a dose, for example, if you're stuck in traffic next to one of these things on a truck, you could get a significant dose of radioactivity. And there are people who live along these routes who would be exposed over and over again to these shipments during routine transports without accidents. So here this graphic shows what gamma radiation is capable of penetrating. This is the mock nuke waste casks that we hauled around the country several times over the course of years. There were multiples of these across the country, used for education purposes, activation purposes across the country. And this is Senator Richard Durbin of Illinois, photographed at the 4th of July parade in Evanston, Illinois, by Dave Kraft of NEIS. This is the Missouri State Capitol. So this is another example of speaking truth to power at NRC headquarters. I think that's Diane DeRigo on one end of the banner there, and Erica Gray. This is a great tradition in American history, nonviolent civil disobedience. This happens to be at FERC on fossil fuel issues, but certainly there's a long history of anti-nuclear nonviolent civil disobedience. Here is the chairman of NEARS being loaded onto a paddy wagon protesting Vermont Yankee a few years back. This is a ship that would be used to move high-level radioactive waste on the oceans, but there are barge shipments on surface waters in the United States proposed as well. So again, the dangers are if one of these things sinks. One of the proposed shipment routes is Lake Michigan, but rivers are also proposed, as are seacoasts. Even a fraction, as Arjun said, of the contents of these containers leaking into Lake Michigan, for example, would threaten the drinking water supply for millions, tens of millions of people downstream. This is another aspect of high-level radioactive waste transportation. This happens to be the reactor pressure vessel from Big Rock Point in Michigan, moving by heavy haul to the nearest railhead, and then it went by train down to South Carolina. But there would be used heavy haul trucks to move high-level radioactive waste under these various proposals, because many of these nuclear power plant sites are not on rail lines. So these things move very slowly. They'd be even more vulnerable to terrorist attack, for example. This particular shipment in the real world had numerous mishaps along the way. I wanted to give some success stories too. This proposal for shipping, again, so-called low-level radioactive waste by boat from Canada to Sweden on surface waters was stopped through citizen action. It would have passed through the Detroit area on the Detroit River. And again, it was people power that put a stop to this. So here's where it would have gone overseas. These are some of the proponents of the shipments: the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission on the left, Bruce Nuclear on the right, who downplay the risks at every turn. But through education, through research by Dr. Gordon Edwards of Canada, it was shown that the shipments were much more dangerous than was revealed. And through First Nations involvement, the Mohawks of Quebec, and this flag is flying as we speak at Standing Rock in North Dakota, these shipments were stopped. A part of the security risk is weapons that are capable of penetrating very thick tank armor. And frighteningly, some years back, Bob Halstead of the state of Nevada Agency for Nuclear Projects testified that some 5,000 TOW anti-tank missiles were available on the black market internationally. A couple years back, ISIS in Syria got a hold of 500 more. These are very powerful weapon systems. So here's the iconic maps of the Yucca transport routes. This gives numbers. This is thanks to the work of folks like Bob Halstead revealing this information. The Department of Energy does not reveal this. When it comes to these shipments, we all live in Andrews County, Texas, because it's going to pass through our communities. We're trying to stop liquid, highly radioactive waste truck shipments. This is Terry Lodge of Toledo, our legal counsel in that campaign. Here's that most likely shipping route right here. This is unprecedented, shipping liquid high-level radioactive waste. Here is Diane Curran and Mindy Goldstein, who've represented the National Environmental Coalition many times, and most recently Diane Curran on behalf of 4 groups, including Seed Coalition, NEARS, and Beyond Nuclear, as well as Public Citizen, fired off a letter to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission demanding that they cease and desist from reviewing the WCS application because it happens to be illegal under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. So another idea for stopping this stuff is resolutions. This is an example from Canada. Beverly Fernandez stopped the Great Lakes nuclear dump. There have been resolutions passed by hundreds of municipalities in the Great Lakes, representing 23 million people now, trying to stop this dump on the Lake Huron shoreline in Canada. How to stop all this environmental justice? You've got Grace Thorpe from Oklahoma on the left. You've got Rufina Marie Laws from Mescalero Apache, New Mexico. They were the leaders who stopped not only the dumps targeted at their own reservations, but then worked with Native Americans and others across the country to stop dozens of these proposals in the past. And then you've got groups like Indigenous Environmental Network, like Honor the Earth, who've been instrumental in stopping these radioactive racist proposals. And of course, Standing Rock, those 2 groups, IEN and Honor the Earth, are on the front lines of this fight in North Dakota. But as has been mentioned, the Department of Energy is sniffing around looking for parking lot dumps, and Native American reservations are very much on that target list. Yucca Mountain will likely now come back because of the Republican success on Election Day just now. So we're going to have to be vigilant against the likes of Shimkus and Upton in the U.S. House who want yucca. They probably now will also pursue parking lot dumps. This is Shimkus leading a tour of Yucca Mountain long after it was canceled. They had to open the place back up just for him to take this congressional tour in there at huge cost to taxpayers, by the way, to open Yucca back up for that tour. You've got whistleblowers. You've got Oscar Shirani, who passed away a few years ago, who revealed the quality assurance violations of the Holtec casks. You've got Dr. Ross Landsman of NRC, now retired, who warned that the disasters are significant that could result from the transport of these containers that have no quality assurance, truth be told. Some inspiring stories from Germany where road blockades and rail blockades have taken place for decades, and the Gorleben centralized interim storage site has been largely shut down. The proposed burial site there has been canceled for the most part. You've got people locking themselves to the train tracks in Germany again and again over years. You've got watchdogs in the U.S. who keep stories alive like the very problematic 3 Mile Island damaged, melted down fuel shipments that passed through St. Louis in the 1980s, people like Kay Dry. And this is how we stop it, people power. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Kevin and Arjun and Karen. We will now open up to participants to either ask questions by raising your hand, raising the hand on your webinar page, or you can type in a question on the, is it the chat box, or is it questions panel?
Okay, so we have...
Again, I want to thank Karen Hadden, Arjun Makhijani, and Kevin Kamps for these really terrific summaries of decades of their work. So in order to ask a question...
Sorry, so if you'd like to ask a question, look at the webinar panel on the right-hand side of your screen. You'll see a button that has a yellow hand on it. If you just press that, then we'll know you want to ask a question, and we'll unmute you. If you'd like to type your question, you can just type that into the question box, and we'll answer it in turn. So we have a couple of questions, I think starting with Ian Zabarte.
Yes, how we can watch the last webinar, and NEARS has a brand new website, and so we hope by early to mid next week we will have the webinars from last Thursday and from tonight linked up there for people to watch. We just had a training today on doing it. So soon at www.nirs.org, and when we get those links we'll also give them to Beyond Nuclear to put on the page, which is to register for an upcoming Nuclear Waste Summit. Next here is Linda Lewison. Is she going to ask it, or do I?
No, you can.
Linda Lewison is asking, how do we answer the assertion that military radioactive waste has been transported on the rails without accident for possibly 40 years? Kevin, do you want to? And Karen and Arjun, you are unmuted, so you can also jump in. We'll have Kevin jump in first on this one.
That's a really great question, Linda. Certainly the nuclear establishment and the nuclear Navy, for example, claim to have a spotless safety record on shipping high-level radioactive waste, but you have to remember that, you know, the 2,500 to 3,000 shipments that have taken place in the United States over the past 75 years since the dawn of the nuclear age have seen dozens of accidents, actually. Bob Halstead, again, State of Nevada, a 1996 report showed that there have been some dozens of accidents, and some of them did release radioactivity beyond the container, beyond the transport vehicle. We can provide this report. A lot of those shipments had to do with contamination, and in France there have been very serious exterior surface contamination incidents transporting high-level radioactive waste. But specifically to this military radioactive waste shipment, one thing I'd like to point out is we can't know, because the U.S. Nuclear Navy is a very secretive institution. They take advantage of their military status, and I would put forth that we really can't know what's happened with those shipments. I do not trust them to be telling the full truth, and we know that there have been, on the civilian side, dozens of incidents in the United States and in France. A significant percentage for years on end of the shipments experienced external contamination.
Arjun or Karen, did you want to say anything on that?
No, Kevin had it.
Okay. One thing I'd like to add, it's Diane, is that the radioactive waste from weapons production is not as radioactive as the commercial irradiated fuel. Actually, the commercial irradiated fuel stays in the core longer, so there are more of those fission products that were described earlier, cesium, strontium, iodines, which are very biologically active and very hot. And so actually there's 99% of the radioactivity in the nuclear fuel chain is in commercial irradiated fuel. So the military shipments are not as hot, but they're still, of course, very, very dangerous. We've got another question here. Has DOE established standards for interim consolidated storage facilities?
Arjun, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, well, you know, these standards would be standards that apply to other fuel cycle facilities, I presume. I don't think there are technical standards for the casks and for the storage facilities. I haven't looked at the private fuel storage standards and the licensing process, but I think that's where we would find the analysis of that. The standards that apply to the uranium fuel cycle are an EPA 40 CFR 190. They limit the radiation to the public. There's also standards that limit radiation exposure to workers, and those are normally the standards that would apply to, for instance, I don't know what the transportation standards are. Does anybody know what the transportation standards are in terms of irradiation of the public along the routes? Are there any?
Well, one of the transportation standards on this stuff we're talking about, even though the Department of Energy would be taking title supposedly and be in charge of this whole thing, it's actually the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's and Department of Transportation standards that would apply. So during shipment, you've got standards such as how much radioactivity, ionizing radioactivity would be allowed at a distance of 2 meters. And that would be 10 millirem per hour, which is 1 to 2 chest x-rays per hour. And then right at the surface of the transportation container, it's much higher, and that's 200 millirem per hour. So that's, you know, much higher than that 2 meter distance. So that's transportation standards. In terms of the centralized interim storage facilities themselves, we learned a lot from our opposition over the course of many years to the Private Fuel Storage Limited Liability Corporation parking lot dump that was targeted at Skull Valley Goshutes Indian Reservation in Utah. The NRC, the standards are leaving a lot to be desired. And this also is the case at on-site storage at nuclear power plants. So, you know, as I mentioned, the whistleblower Oscar Shirani showed that the quality assurance on the Holtec containers, which are deployed to like 3 dozen atomic reactors in the United States, the quality assurance is largely non-existent. Oscar Shirani led a national audit for the nuclear power industry. He from Exelon Nuclear, but many utilities were involved, and they found major violations of quality assurance in the design and fabrication of the Holtec containers, which are certified not only for on-site storage or parking lot dump storage, but also for transportation themselves. And it's really playing with fire. The NRC never rectified the situation. They had done a previous QA audit and found nothing wrong. The NRC did, and then Shirani's team found major violations. So NRC talks a good line, but when you look into the details, it's really out of control.
This is Diane. The private fuel storage facility did have some license criteria, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission licensed it because the federal government was not going to take title to the irradiated or spent fuel. The utilities were not really interested in pursuing sending their waste off to the site in Utah. The facilities now that are being proposed in Texas and New Mexico and possibly other places, but specifically Waste Control Specialist, WCS in Texas, and Lee Eddy County, their hope is that they can change the federal law to allow the title to transfer to the U.S. taxpayers, and they would simply be providing a storage pad that would not have any of the kinds of safety criteria that a permanent repository would need, and they would be similar or the same as the type of storage criteria that are at reactors called IFEs or ISFCs, spent fuel storage installations. However, at the reactors, there is an amount of security at a reactor site. These new centralized locations would have much, much more. They'd have fuel from all the reactors around the country, or many of them, and would not necessarily have the level of security that a reactor would have. And they would only have to meet, they would only be licensed for 20 years. Even though we know that the fuel is dangerous, as was mentioned earlier, for literally into the millions of years. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, requires 1 million years of planning for a permanent repository, yet this supposedly interim site would only have a 20-year license, and then in 20 years, what happens?
So we have a couple of hands raised to ask oral questions. Like to go to Don Safer first, and also want to note, Mo Headington, your hand is raised, but it looks like there might be a problem with your phone line. If you want to check that, we'll turn to your question right after Don Safer's. Don?
Hi, do you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great, thanks. I've enjoyed the presentations. Thank you. The zirconium cladding, there's a lot of questions around the zirconium cladding, particularly at high burnup levels, which most all of the industry has gone to. So what happens when zirconium cladding fails? And just if you can tell me.
You know, Diane, we have with us on the phone Donna Gilmore, and perhaps she might like to answer that.
Let's let Arjun go first.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I looked into this question quite a bit when we were doing the work on the waste confidence rule, and actually presented in Donna Gilmore's backyard there back then. What happens when you irradiate more than used to be done in the 70s and 80s? The zirconium fuel rods are subjected to a lot more radiation, a lot more neutron damage. There are, very fine sort of damage that appears anyway in these things, which results in leaks of small amount of radioactivity. That's how the water gets contaminated and needs to be filtered. And that kind of damage is aggravated at high burnup. The other thing that happens is they become more susceptible to damage when they are removed from the water and put into dry storage when the fuel dries out. And so this becomes now a much greater problem, because we normally regarded dry storage as the safer storage, and it is from a terrorism point of view. But now you have high burnup fuel that if you put it into dry storage and then leave it there for a very long time, it could sustain damage over long periods of storage, and then you have the problem of transferring it to another cask and radiation issues and contaminated issues. Donna has, I think, studied this more than anybody else.
And Donna will be presenting on our next webinar next Thursday, so please tune in, a little teaser for that. Donna is very well informed, and we will have that be a part of next week's presentation.
Great. And so we'll try to unmute Mo Headington to see if Mo can ask her question. If not, it looks like she might have typed it in as well. No, Mo, sorry, it looks like your audio connection isn't working. So we'll turn to the written question.
Bob Halstead, who's from Nevada, once referenced a 0.5 mile rule where property sellers must disclose to purchasers that the property is within 0.5 miles of nuclear transport routes. Where is this being done? This should be expanded nationwide as a way to include the public, as it will impact property values as well as highlight the public safety issue. This is from Mo Headington, Stand Up Saves Lives in Burbridge, Illinois. Kevin?
Yeah, it's an excellent point, Mo. You know, the Kamps case in New Mexico, which was associated with the waste isolation pilot plant shipments, a bypass was built around Santa Fe, and the Kamps family that owned property along that route sued the city of Santa Fe for putting them in that predicament, and they won a jury trial. They were awarded the damages decided by the jury for loss of property value because their land was along a nuclear waste shipment route. And to answer your question, where is this warning being given by realtors to potential buyers, sellers to buyers? Well, I don't know that it is being done. The Department of Energy is certainly not warning anyone. And, you know, this talk that Karen mentioned of consent-based siting, of centralized interim storage, of permanent disposal sites, you know, we got John Kotak of the Department of Energy to admit at the very first meeting last January in Washington, D.C., that they are not seeking consent from transportation corridor communities. He cited the Interstate Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution. They are not seeking consent from the people that live in these towns and cities and villages in most states that would see these irradiated nuclear fuel shipments passing through by road, by rail, by waterway. So I think there's some real problems with informed consent along the transportation routes. In fact, the Department of Energy is kind of thumbing its nose at the entire concept of that.
Kevin, I have to jump in for just a moment. This is Karen Hadden, and sort of add to that fact that from our perspective here in Texas, when we listened into DOE meetings around the country, and we had people fly out to Tempe because it was longer than a day's drive to get to the closest meeting that they held. And we heard the DOE portraying, you know, sometimes it was direct, sometimes it was more implied, that people in Texas want this radioactive waste. Well, that is simply just not true. And it was incredibly frustrating to hear it being put out that way, and to hear them almost asking other communities if they wouldn't like to go ahead and send it our way. And they were doing that based on the fact that 4 commissioners in Andrews County and a county judge voted to accept the waste in Andrews County. Well, this is a county that would stand to make a lot of money off of this waste coming in, no doubt a percentage. They get a percentage now on the low-level radioactive waste. Well, the other counties aren't doing that, and the rest of the state is not. And this year, at least through the Democratic Party, there were resolutions that passed. It was the #1 resolution throughout the state this year, and at the state level it became part of the state platform that we oppose having storage in our state, and that we oppose having transport of it for the purpose of storage. So there is a lot of opposition, but the voices simply are just not being heard the same way, and it's really frustrating to have the DOE portraying otherwise.
Okay, we have a question from Michelle Lee. Michelle says, thank you for your service to the American public. I am curious about what you all believe will be the major battles coming up with a new administration, and what public advocates might have to do differently to mount an effective response. I also wonder if there are any 2016 economic analyses we should know about.
Arjun?
Yeah, well, I think there's a risk of 2 different things. As you know, there are many Republicans on Congress, and maybe not only Republicans, who have never let go of the idea of Yucca Mountain, even though the project was canceled in 2009 and defunded and has been deactivated. I mean, there's still a hole in the ground there, and the people of Nevada haven't given consent. Now, Harry Reid is no longer going to be in the Senate, and it's a Republican Senate, so they may be able to pass legislation basically reopening Yucca Mountain, so that is a risk. As I said, Yucca Mountain, I'm personally not opposed to a geologic isolation program, but I think it should be science-based and not politics-based. In the bad sense of the word, you know, there's a law, Nuclear Waste Policy Act. It wasn't implemented properly. It wasn't implemented, I think, in good faith in terms of science being first. And Yucca Mountain is the worst single repository. So that's a possibility. The other is because the DOE sort of in haste and hubris signed all these contracts to start taking the spent fuel by January 1998 and then violated every single one of those contracts, the taxpayer is basically under court order paying utilities to store this waste basically in the form of a fine. And so there's a significant federal liability, and what this so-called interim storage does is by federal government taking title to the waste, to that extent, the bleeding of the money to the utility stops. But of course the bleeding of the money doesn't stop because the federal government will still have to pay for that storage at the interim site, and that's why the private company is involved in it. But I think there's a very significant risk of these two things happening.
Could I just add, this is Kevin, you know, the election results are so nightmarish from a couple, 3 days ago, but we have successfully fended off the Yucca Mountain dump and the mobile Chernobyls it would launch for a generation. And that has taken place through some very dark times politically as well. And we certainly are now facing some huge challenges, at least for the next 2 years, if not for the next 4 years. But we have stopped this for a very long time. We worked with the likes of Senator Harry Reid, who's now retiring, but we'll have to work with other allies on the Hill to defend ourselves and defend our country. And that's what we're going to do. And I think we're going to rise to the occasion, and we're going to stop this thing.
Connie Klein asks, how much more expensive is hardened on-site storage than wet or dry storage? Is expense the only or the main reason for utility or other opposition?
Well, in a rational word, expense would not be the main reason because it doesn't add much cost. I think it's a 1/10 of a cent or 2/10 of a cent to nuclear power. The problem is that this hasn't been spent as the waste was put in into spent fuel or as the waste was generated. So now there's a backlog, and of course it would take a fair amount of money to do hardened storage for all of that. But in principle, it's not a lot of money per kilowatt hour generated. And when you count that nuclear power is only 19 or 20% of the total electricity, in terms of the cost of electricity, it would be a minimal amount. Not negligible, but it will be small. But the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has said to these kind of proposals, leave alone hardened storage, but moving waste from very dense pools to dry storage to reduce the risk of fire, for instance. They have said reduce the risk of fire in case of loss of coolant. They have said that wet storage is safe enough, and so we don't need to impose the cost. Doesn't meet the cost-benefit test. So it's, according to them, everything is just fine as it is.
Kevin, did you have any input on that one?
Yeah, it goes back to Michelle Lee's question too about recent economic analyses. One that's really valuable, it was a part of what Arjun mentioned there, the coalition efforts where Arjun and Dr. Mark Cooper from Vermont Law School and others served as our expert witnesses against nuclear waste confidence at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And Dr. Cooper did an economic analysis of the next 200 years of commercial irradiated nuclear fuel management in the United States. And the figure he came up with was pretty startling for what it's going to cost. It was a figure of $210 billion to $350 billion. And the public is going to pay for that, whether it's U.S. federal taxpayers or ratepayers on a state-by-state basis. And what Dr. Cooper pointed out is that that instantly doubled the generation costs of nuclear electricity, only it's never been accounted for. And, you know, what is going on at the nuclear power plant sites is a tremendous cost savings in terms of leaving the pools packed to the gills for as long as possible, deferring dry cask storage costs for as long as possible, at the expense of taking huge safety and environmental risks, because these pools are mega catastrophes waiting to happen if they lose their cooling water supply, whether due to accident or natural disaster or attack. We've now seen that Fukushima could have been an order of magnitude or orders of magnitude worse if the Unit 4 pool had gone up in flames. It's the reason Prime Minister Khan had a secret evacuation plan to evacuate 35 to 50 million people from the Metro Tokyo and northeastern Japan region. So that's the expense, that's the risk-taking to save money at nuclear power plant sites.
And our next webinar will talk more about the distinction between dry storage and hardened on-site storage and the dangers of fuel pools. We have one last question here from Jan Boudart. Isn't zirconium cladding the origin of the hydrogen explosions that are a great danger in places like Fukushima Daiichi and Sellafield? When the temperature gets high, it reacts with and separates water to create huge quantities of hydrogen gas. Arjun, can we pull you on that?
I mean, yeah, the central sort of common mode problem with the type of reactor we have is exactly as described. During a loss of coolant accident, when there's steam in contact with the zirconium and the fuel rods, the zirconium is oxidized and hydrogen is liberated. And not only that, but that is an exothermic reaction. So it's a chemical reaction that liberates heat. So you get more steam and more reaction. So it's a kind of a self-reinforcing reaction. That's how you get a lot of hydrogen. That is the hydrogen that caused the explosions in Fukushima. Actually, there was a fire or explosion in 3 Mile Island, but it was contained because of the containment vessel at 3 Mile Island, different than Fukushima. And so this problem has been recognized almost since the beginning. The man who actually designed the zirconium fuel cladding, so it's not a simple matter of just preventing accidents. These fuel rods have to have a lot of different properties, not absorb too many neutrons, withstand the heat, be able to contain the spent fuel, be able to withstand the neutron damage, and so on. So, but we have known for some time that there are alternative materials. In fact, the man who did this, invented these zirconium fuel rods, zircaloy fuel rods, alerted the world to this problem, published an article about it, I believe in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, saying we should have a plan B. And basically there wasn't a plan B. Silicon carbide fuel rods would be much more robust. They have been researched for quite a long time, not from a safety point of view, but to be able to increase burnup and increase the amount of power you could get from a single loading of fuel rods. But after Fukushima, I actually asked the NRC staff that did the report, is why did you not consider a different material for the fuel rod cladding to replace the zirconium, because that is really the source of the explosion problem and the key problem in meltdown accidents. And I didn't get a clear answer. I was told, well, we didn't consider it because it's common to all reactors, and I would have thought you would consider it if it were common to all reactors, because you're solving a common problem to all reactors. But there you are, the problem has been known, and we have a solution. It wouldn't be easy to implement. It would be costly. It would take some time. But it isn't even being considered for existing reactors, unfortunately.
We have another question here from James Henry. Which private contractors would be making the most profit from interstate transport of spent or irradiated fuel and from interim storage? Kevin's got his hand raised.
Well, one company that doesn't stick its head up in a very high profile is called Edlo International, based in Washington, D.C. on DuPont Circle. They would be the middleman for all this transportation, but because the Department of Energy has chosen mostly rail for shipping the waste around the country, you're talking the big train companies. And in fact, the trade association for the rail companies a year ago in the Shimkus hearing on Capitol Hill was all for all this stuff. You know, they too said they could do it very safely, no problem. Well, they're the ones who are going to be paid for moving this stuff around. And of course, we've seen their performance with the bomb trains, the Tarzans, and the Bakken crude that's exploding. And we saw the horrendous catastrophe in Quebec, where the fossil fuel train ended up killing over 50 people in that horrific accident. So these railway companies in the United States, you know, have a lot to answer for. This will be some of the most hazardous material ever transported on the rails. And then in terms of interim storage, and of course Karen can speak to her experience down there in Texas, but Holtec International, I mentioned the whistleblowers, Oscar Shirani and Dr. Ross Landsman. Holtec International is a real rogue corporation, and they are the corporation behind the New Mexico proposal. So we really have to worry about the character of the companies involved in these proposals.
Karen, did you want to talk about AREVA and NAC International at WCS?
Well, I would like to say that WCS is also very questionable. They've had workers irradiated already at the site. They had ongoing contamination of workers in the cafeteria really early on, and it affected quite a number of people. So we do worry about that. And we've had, in the world of transport and the trains, we've had one union representative come to us, a railroad union representative, and say that they and the workers are very, very concerned about their risk if this moves forward. I don't know how vocal they're going to be, but it was interesting to hear from them from the start.
So it's AREVA and NAC International that are working together with waste control specialists in their application to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for the proposed Texas supposedly interim storage license for 20 years. And
Yes.
Holtec would be the company with the the Lee County and Eddy County alliance in New Mexico. So those are the companies that are outright going to be doing the application and propose to do an application for New Mexico.
Could I say?
Yeah, that's right. And I would add that the NAC containers had a temperature rating that was below the temperatures that get reached at the WCS site in the desert. That was one of the issues that the NRC raised. It's like, well, how do you account for this? What's going to happen if they can't take the hot desert temperatures?
This is Kevin. I was just going to say a word about AREVA. There's so much that could be said about AREVA's corporate character. But I mentioned earlier the contaminated shipments in France, and that was AREVA. It was AREVA of France. And they had 25% to 33% of the shipments of high-level radioactive waste going into the reprocessing facility that were externally contaminated above regulatory limits. Oftentimes at 500 times regulatory limits. In one case, 3,000 times regulatory limits. This went on for years until revealed by journalists and activists. So, you know, for years on end, Spence Abraham, who had been George W. Bush's energy secretary, who approved as energy secretary the Yucca Mountain dump under George W. Bush, then went to work as the North American chairman of AREVA. And so, you know, we should do an expose on all of the skeletons in the closets of these various companies because they're numerous.
AREVA is on the verge of bankruptcy. They're building reactors that they just cannot afford, and it looks like they've got some desperate hope that they can start making some money here in Texas. If we got any more questions? We're getting on to the end of our presentation. I'd like to thank once again everyone for joining us for the hour and a half, for our presenters, for our participants, and we hope that some of you will join us at the Nuclear Waste Summit in Chicago in December.